All right, good morning once again. If everybody could take a seat, we're going to get started with panel number 2. So, again, welcome. My name is Ken Bernstein. I'm a principal city planner with LA Department of City Planning and Office of Historic Resources, and very proud to be here this morning to guide us through this second discussion, which I think is going to be incredibly stimulating. I can really think of no better trio than the three in front of you this morning to really talk about, having seen now the centers concept and the thinking that went into it in the 1960s, to look at what happened and what worked and what didn't. What is the legacy of the centers concept, especially during its first 25 or 30 years. And we have three remarkable practitioners who were very much in the arena during that time period to reflect upon some of the successes, the shortcomings, and lessons learned of the centers concept Los Angeles. You have full bios in your program, which I hope you're taking a look at, but just to give you a sense of what each of them bring to this discussion, we have Jan Perry immediately next to me, who was for 12 years LA City Council member, 2001 to 2013, representing downtown Los Angeles, kind of the center of centers, and South Los Angeles. Jan also, most recently for the city, was the general manager of the Economic and Workforce Development Department, EWDD. She's now heading a nonprofit on infrastructure financing. Back in the day, she was a chief deputy to her predecessor on the city council, a planning deputy to Councilmember Mike Wu, serving Hollywood and portions of the San Fernando Valley, so brings a wealth of experience around these topics. Next to Jan, Zev Yaroslavsky, who served in elective office here in Los Angeles for nearly 40 years. He started when he was 12, and 1975 he was elected, actually at the age of 26, to the 5th Council District, serving for 19 years on the LA City Council and about 20 years on the LA County Board of Supervisors, representing communities that were seeing rapid change throughout the period that we're discussing, and significant battles around growth and development. And then Emily Gable-Luddy, who is a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects, had a long career with the LA Department of City Planning, and really was grappling with the legacy of the centers concept in her work, spearheading the development of the general plan framework, really being the lead staff for that effort. Woody Cheshire, who you'll hear on the final panel, was Emily's partner in crime on the general plan framework that ultimately superseded Concept Los Angeles in 1996. She also established the Urban Design Studio for the Department of City Planning, and many of you may know that now, after retiring from LA City Planning, she ran for elective office, became council member in the city of Burbank. She is now the mayor of the city of Burbank, and dealing with Los Angeles, that 800-pound gorilla on her border, in a very different way. So we're so thrilled to have all of them with us today. One thing I just wanted to add before we get into some of the discussion is that the historic overview was really compelling, and Bob Dannon brings images in particular. One thing I did want to mention is that there has been a continuity of thinking about centers in Los Angeles. And I give a kind of an orientation overview to many of our new planners in our department, talking about planning history. And one thing I note is that this idea of centers didn't actually begin with the centers concept. It began with previous planning directors in LA City Planning. Actually, Gordon Whitnall, who was the first planning director in Los Angeles, his big idea was what he called civic ganglion, which were zoning some communities like Hollywood and other major centers for high density development around transportation networks. And then Charles Bennett, one of the longest serving planning directors in Los Angeles in the 1940s and 50s, developed a similar idea for the San Fernando Valley, what he called his Valley Nuclei plan, which again were urban nuclei linked by a transportation system, in this case a highway system, but retaining agriculture and green belts around it. So leading up to the centers concept, there had been similar ideas. But I thought we would organize the discussion for this panel around pulling out some actually direct quotations from the centers concept and getting our panelists to react to what extent were these visions actually realized. And we'll start with the centers themselves. So and you've heard some of it in the first panel, the idea of the centers concept and the one of the key phrases in the document was to preserve the low-density residential character of Los Angeles, protect stable single-family residential neighborhoods from encroachment by other uses, rehabilitate or rebuild deteriorated single-family residential areas for the same use. So let me start, Zev, with you. Thinking back on this period after the center's concept, 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s, how did we do in creating these centers? How successful were we in creating these high-intensity centers and then protecting single-family neighborhoods? Did we?
I think we did a pretty good job protecting single-family neighborhoods, not completely, but I think that's certainly been one of the, in the last half century, one of the outcomes. I wouldn't say an outcome of the center's plan, but out of the body politic that sought to protect them, and not just in the West Side, but in many communities around Los Angeles where people value their quality of life. I wanted to say something about the center's concept. I was born and raised in Boyle Heights, so I like that last slide presentation. I lived right in the middle of what became the major interchange. And I would like to revisit the idea of that airport on Union Station. I think just to see what the public debate would be like. It would be almost like watching roller derby. My parents came from the old country in the former Soviet Union, and I studied Soviet stuff a little bit when I was in college and otherwise. And the one thing that I remember more than anything else is the 5-year plans that the Soviet government always put forward. 5-year plan to keep the population of Moscow, below this level, and 5-year plan to do that, and 5-year plan to produce more beef, and none of them ever worked out. And I think there is a comparison to be made between planning here and planning there. And what do I mean by that? My experience has been that when you're planning doing land use planning, you can definitely prevent people from doing what you don't want them to do, but you can't make them do what you'd like them to do. The free market economy, tax breaks, public attitudes, demand for certain kinds of uses and services determine whether something's going to fly or isn't going to fly. So the center's concept, as far as I'm concerned, like so many other plans, were in part a piece of paper that reflected what was already happening organically in the region. Downtown was happening for 100 years, and Hollywood was happening for 75, 80 years. Westwood maybe a little less, Van Nuys, et cetera. They were happening, and I think the center's concept was as much an homage to what was already happening on the street than a concept that somebody invented in the ivory tower and decided this would be a good idea. So I would go back to give you an example of what we can't do. I represented Melrose Avenue for my entire career. I grew up after we moved out of Boyle Heights on the corner of Martell and Melrose. Those of you who know the area know it's like, the main intersection of Melrose. When I grew up on Martell and Melrose, the most intense use on Melrose was an insurance agency's office. It was dead. It was absolutely dead. And then in 1979-80, all of a sudden, somebody opened up a funky shop. It did well. 5 more funky shops went up. Years later, 50 funky shops went up. And Melrose became this internationally known strip of a mile and a half. That when I went to Tokyo, Japan in 1980 on a delegation trip, there was a store in Tokyo called Melrose. Now, if I had come up with the idea as a city councilman, or if you had come up with the idea as a planner, let's make Melrose this funky street, and it would become internationally known, you would have been laughed out of town, and you wouldn't have even thought to do it because you wouldn't know how to do it. It happened organically. So I tell you that story because when it comes to the center's concept, the plan, this goes for a lot of plans, is that you can definitely prevent things. You can limit height. You can limit density. You can require setbacks. You can do you require parking or don't require parking. You can do all of those things. but you can't mandate what will be done. And so
I want to come back
I'll
to that
stop.
because there were other centers as well that perhaps were not anticipated. But I wanted to get Jan to react to the emphasis on protecting stable single-family neighborhoods, preserving low-density residential character. And to some degree, that was true in South LA as well, which is a part of the city that has many stable, lower-density neighborhoods. But when you hear that language and see that in the Concept Los Angeles document, how does that resonate to you, again, having represented downtown and South LA in the subsequent years? What's the legacy of that emphasis?
Well, in South Los Angeles, a community that was probably at its height when people were employed by Goodyear in World War II activities, there was a very strong, very healthy middle class that had moved east and south into South Los Angeles, particularly when you look around Central Avenue. It was home to Ralph Bunche for a while. There was a lot of stability and a lot of opportunity, but there was not a lot of focus. And then as time went on in the 60s and 70s, you started to see the political structure. There weren't term limits there, so the political structure was reasonably stable, but there was a lot of zone changes going on in single-family residential neighborhoods. So then you began to see streets change from completely single-family to single-family, and then one house apartment building, house apartment building, and it began to disrupt the side streets of the residential community in a negative way. Because it brought higher density housing side by side with deeply into the single-family residential. And, people weren't thinking along center concepts then where you concentrate along transportation corridors because that made more sense to build the higher density housing there. And fast forward to the redevelopment agency and the, battles and struggles that went through, it finally settled on a good plan for south of the Santa Monica Freeway on the transportation corridors and focusing higher density housing on the transportation corridors. And I think, in my limited perspective, that was the first time I had actually seen a policy on paper that actually worked to protect the single-family residential and, the quality of life, and yet encourage growth and address the growth that had already occurred and had occurred, as Zev said, organically because it was already there, so people did need to be housed.
But some of the single-family neighborhoods the concept plan was trying to protect were also perhaps the legacy of perhaps exclusion, or certainly a legacy of redlining as well. And so I don't know if you can speak to that, and again, how that was, the legacy of that in the neighborhoods you represent.
Everybody is probably familiar with CC&R's codes, covenants, and restrictions that said that, African Americans, Jews, at the time people were referred to as Mexicans, had to be out of certain communities by sundown, and of course couldn't acquire property in certain areas. And so that's why you had seen the growth of communities in the East and the South. And in fact, when our own citizens, Japanese Americans, were interned and taken from their properties, there was a period of time where many African Americans owned property or held property for their Japanese brothers and sisters in Little Tokyo, and it was actually referred to for a time as Bronzeville. And when people came back from incarceration, the African American community, middle class community, moved south.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We'll bring Emily in a second, but I want to come back to Zev's point, though, that you made about the fact the center's concept doesn't dictate what will happen. There were a number of centers that perhaps were not envisioned by Bob Dannenbrink and the team in the 1960s. You had the West Side Pavilion pop up along Pico in your district. You had the transformation of a Sleepy Pony Farm into the Beverly Center. Melrose you referred to. More high-rises along Wilshire and Westwood than might have been anticipated. What happened? How did these, perhaps unanticipated, given the number of dots or circles that are on that map and the hierarchy, how did these other centers emerge in the aftermath of the center's concept?
Well, first of all, Wilshire and Westwood was a center, okay, and is a center, and it has a little university next door that has a daily population of 60,000. It's one of the major employers in the county. So that and it was a center before before the center's concept. It became more intense, and it was encouraged through the zoning at the time. When I became the councilman, the FAR on Wilshire Boulevard and the commercial FAR was 10-1. We cut it down to 6-1, and we were called no growthers. 6-1 FAR. On the Beverly Center and the West Side Pavilion and some others around town, those are really poster childs for kind of the uprising that took place in the mid-'80s. And this predates the Friends of Westwood case and some of the other lawsuits that came down. In those days, you could build as long as you were within the zoning and you didn't seek a discretionary act, whatever was defined as a discretionary act by the city, you could build whatever the zoning allowed. The West Side Pavilion was a 3-1 building. It was a shopping center before. It was a small shopping center, one story, and they came in and exercised their rights under the zoning. One of the reasons it was such a colossal disaster in terms of parking and the parking arrangements there, they didn't want to change anything because they would have had to come to the city for a discretionary act, and they would have never gotten it through the city. The Beverly Center is the same exact thing. It's a 3-1 building. Happens to be 8 stories high because city didn't count parking as part of the FAR, so the first 5 floors are parking above grade because there's a water table that's about 6 inches below grade, and the top 3 floors are the shopping center. And I think all of us were kind of surprised to see, not that the pony rides would go, they weren't going to last forever. I was a main customer of the pony rides, but nobody would have ever anticipated that colossus to be built at that.
But these
corner.
were by right projects.
These were by right projects, and so what Prop U.
Emily's looking skeptical. I want to bring her in. But you recall these were by right. I do want to bring Emily into the discussion, and again, to quote from the Concept Los Angeles document, there's an emphasis in the document as well on implementation and tying this plan to implementation. And it speaks to the development of a comprehensive development code incorporating zoning, land subdivision, and housing regulations must be adopted in order to give assurance of coordinated, well-planned development. So you were in the planning department during that time. Was there a focus on that type of follow-up and implementation, linking zoning and a development code to the vision in the plan?
There's a deep legacy about that. I do want to say that calling something a ganglia or a nucleus just is not the right message you want to give when you're trying to get people to think about their city in a different manner. So the center's concept was both an elegant solution by its message, but also by the conceptualization that I think the first panel presented. I was only going to challenge Zev a little bit on this, and I'd love to know the backstory. Maybe we can do this over lunch. But when I was in the planning department and the Beverly Center was proposed, there was a lot of buzz among the planners about how this did not fit the center's concept because the Beverly Center was not on the center's concept map, and the closest thing to it was Hollywood. So from our perspective, I think as young planners looking for the holding, the line on this, the decision to make a finding of consistency with the general plan and the center's concept was an issue that Hamilton rolled on because he just didn't hold the line on what the center's concept was. But there was a finding of consistency required. The planning department made it. I don't know who was in charge at that time. Who knows? And the Beverly Center emerged. Now, this was sort of disheartening to all the planners. Yeah. Well, I'm sure Cal was pushed on this because he had the ability to say, no, it's not a center. The center's in Hollywood. So I think there's a good backstory to that. I've said before, yes, implementation is ultimately the vision of any kind of long-range plan, and I think the city did follow through with some remarkably fine community plans that came on the heels of the center's concept. There was some very good thinking, the thinking in the Brentwood Palisades plan, thinking in the Sherman Oaks Studio City plan. There were a lot of very interesting things that were incorporated into that showed that these plans did, in fact, emerge from community members. But the difficulty was that you would see a single-family neighborhood, and everybody would assume it's single-family, but it was zoned R3. So the neighbors themselves were shocked when they saw the first few homes go down and apartments being built as of right, because the plan said one thing. The plan was in yellow, as Jane and I were discussing earlier, but the zoning was in orange. And the first thing to roil that situation was the Hillsides Federation's lawsuit against the city and the ultimate passing of state law for LA to bring its zoning into compliance with its general plan. Had the general plans had the power that they were, shown to have, then I think we'd have a more peaceful series of developments of the city over time.
Yeah. And so that's what's often called AB 283 that you're referring to, which was the state law that did that. And to what extent was that really an outgrowth of a desire to fully implement the concept Los Angeles, or was it really just, was the concept at that point forgotten? Was this an effort to bring the zoning fully into conformance with that vision, or was this a separate effort altogether?
Well, I think, and Zev certainly can speak to this too, as well as Jan, the reaction from the Hillside Federation for the failure to implement consistency between the plan and zoning came out of great frustration and some significant development projects, and I don't even remember what they were. Mm-hmm. But that was part of it. And the same thing with, Zev can speak to Prop U, the reaction to the 3-to-1 FAR came out of the overdevelopment of certain sites within the city of LA, and people went, this is nuts. And Zev and Mark Browdy at the time stepped up to cut back, sort of a meat cleaver approach, all the 3-to-1 FAR in the city to 1.5-to-1.
Yeah, and I want to come back to Prop U, but I think one of the reasons you saw Prop U certainly was a frustration during that time period about growing traffic congestion and the transportation impacts. And it gets back to our first panel as well, the linkage between this plan and our transportation network. And again, to quote from the Concept Los Angeles plan, it said, the funding and development of a rapid transit system must be advocated and supported in order to provide for efficient movement of people within the city. Station locations should be confined for the most part to intensively developed centers. Local feeder lines should be built as an integral part of the rapid transit system, although the plan did acknowledge the automobile will continue to provide the principal means of transportation in the suburbs. So what happened? Why didn't this network emerge? We're seeing it now, kind of redeveloping the transportation network we once had with the streetcar system, but why wasn't the attention there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to develop that connectivity between the centers? Jan or Zev?
I think that, let me speak to my experience on the Exposition Line Authority. I think people finally aged out. The people who were always opposed to putting light rail through, their communities, finally aged out, and then their children grew up and were tired of being on the road 2 and 3 hours a day, and were more willing and more open and more receptive. I can't remember. You weren't on the Exposition. You were on the Expo Line Authority. Yeah, that's right.
For its entire
for the
existence.
Oh yes, you made quite an impression on me.
Scars to prove it.
Yes, that's right. Well, I was always looking right. You were to my left, so but that there was a level of receptivity with much fewer gadflies, I would say. We only had 2 really serious ones. And welcomeness, because I think people got tired. And once they realized that the technology had changed, and the tracks were quieter, and so quiet that we actually had to add things back in so that when trains approached intersections and stations, people had to be alerted. That's how quiet they were. And the fact that it had the potential for enhancing people's property values was a sweetener in some ways. And
so you're saying the plan couldn't be fully realized until certain people died off or moved away? Not died off, but attitudes changed.
Yeah. And then the people who were firmly and deeply committed to their cars, mm-hmm. and versus people who are living longer, working longer, having children later, and needing places to live that they can afford. To have that support system of a public transportation system that connects people at different income levels and gives them a chance to be able to go and work in other parts of the city that they might not otherwise be able to even reach. That's the change. It's a generational shift.
Zev, what was your experience? Why didn't this happen more quickly, the movement to recreate a transit system in Los Angeles? And was that the real disconnect of this plan, and why you had frustration that began to boil over into Prop U and a backlash against growth and development?
Well, those are two different questions. There's one principal reason, in my opinion, why attitudes change, and they did change. Jan is absolutely right. Cheviot Hills, which is the ground zero for the opposition to the Expo light rail line, the opposition dissipated, not because they aged out so much as because it now took an hour and a half to get downtown to go see the Lakers play or to see a concert at the Music Center, where it used to take 25 or 30 minutes. People who lived on the west side of the 405 found that it took an hour to get from west of the 405 to east of the 405 in the PM peak. Traffic patterns changed. When I first got to be first elected, the primary direction of traffic was into downtown in the AM peak, and it was really free flow going west, and in the afternoon going out to the suburbs, it was bumper to bumper traffic. About 25 years later, it had reversed. Now it's bumper to bumper in both directions. Now, I don't think there was a lack of effort to build a transit network. In fact, starting with Tom Bradley, who had the vision, and just before he left office, broke ground. I think either broke ground or cut the ribbon on the first leg of the subway. It takes time, as we know. It takes time and it takes money, and we didn't have a lot of time and we didn't have a lot of money. So but we are now on a momentum. Now it's the biggest transportation infrastructure project in the country, if not in the world, that's under construction now in the city. But I want to say something about this. Goes back to my first comment. You can't make people do what they don't want to do. You can try, and the MTA is trying now. They're going to make you have to pay a lot of money to drive in certain parts of the city, and it may work, but the people who are going to be paying the price for that, not the financial price, but the convenience price, are going to be people who can't afford to pay the fee, the congestion pricing fee. And that's a big chunk of the population of Los Angeles County. Almost 45% of the households in Los Angeles County have an annual household income of less than $60,000, 43%. You do the math when you get home. What you could live on how you would function at $60,000 a year or less household income. Notwithstanding that, and despite the major infrastructure investment we're making, use of public transportation at the MTA is plummeting. It's down almost 20% in the last few years. Why? Nobody at MTA can tell you why. I think there's a pretty good idea why. Incomes are slightly starting to increase. People would rather have the independence of their cars and the flexibility of having their cars, even if they have to pay a fortune to park, than to go on what they perceive to be an inferior system. So I do believe that the quote you gave out of the plan, that transportation is important, but the automobile is going to remain, notwithstanding what my colleagues in academia say and people in the ivory tower think, and even some planners think. The automobile is going to be the backbone of our transportation system, and you can fight it all you want, but it's going to continue to be that way.
And let me bring Emily back in. So given what the plan said and what Zev has just stated, and clearly the plan recognized the automobile's kind of primary role, particularly in the suburbs, was this plan flawed from the outset in envisioning all these transit connections between the various centers? Was that a realistic vision, and how were you grappling with that in the planning work to come?
Well, no, I don't think the plan was flawed from the outset. I think what's instructive, going back to the center's concept, is that as it's proposed behind me to the Planning Commission at the time, it showed a sophistication that did not appear in the final adoption. So what do I mean? I just mean that the centers were identified as small, medium, and large. Some were appropriate at a smaller scale in certain neighborhoods. Others were larger, like all the way through Hollywood. It becomes a regional center, and it continues into the 90s and the 2000s as a regional center. So that's the proper recognition of an area that has started with density and continues to accommodate density. But other areas like, I think, Venice and maybe Mar Vista and those kinds of centers are smaller. They're more neighborhood-oriented. And to build a bridge to the framework, that's basically how we approached it in developing the work program for the general plan framework, was to recognize that there are nuances of focused growth areas that should be recognized and nurtured. And then outside of that, the areas around should be preserved in a lower density category. By nurturing this gradation of centers, then you actually set the table for heavy rail, subway, light rail, Gold Line, Blue Line, and hopefully the Orange Line eventually, and then commuter rail. The other thing that has significantly changed since the centers concept was conceived of was all of these cross-mountain freeways disappeared. So no Laurel Canyon, no Reseda, the kinds of things that would have represented, I think, a significant degradation to the larger landscape within which Los Angeles fits. Those went away one by one, either through state action or through lack of action to actually designate a new freeway. This is probably one of the most significant form-giving changes to Los Angeles that occurred between the adoption of the centers and the development of the general plan framework.
Yeah. Another big change that I did want to mention was Prop 13 coming in 1978. And what's interesting, going back to the Concept Los Angeles plan, is that there was an understanding about the importance of the fiscalization of land use, fiscal issues, and it advocates, in fact, for what it says, changes in the state property tax laws must be advocated, such changes to provide that assessments shall be based upon the land use potentials designated by the general plan of a city, not on land prices, which reflect a speculative expectation of some other use. So we got a change in the state property tax laws, but perhaps not what was anticipated. What impact did that have on what we saw in the ensuing decades? Jan, do you want to?
Well, let me make a quick comment, and then I'm sure Zeb can add into that. Prop 13 had an unequal application. When you look at areas of the city that were the oldest in the city, where the city started on the east side and the south side and then went west, where you could still actually find sidewalks that are made out of sand and water and are still there and crumbling, or when the sewer system is inadequate, and everything about it is inadequate and was never corrected. All Prop 13 did is take away that pot of money that was used to maintain or correct or update the infrastructure, took it away from an area that was already very, very old, and satisfied folks who had worked justifiably so hard for their property, and it benefited them, and I don't have anything against that. But the outcome of that was that of the other part of the city began to fall apart at the seams.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to make two comments. I want to speak one to Prop 13, but one I want to just get on the record. I am a supporter of the center's concept. It's an aspirational document, and it makes sense for Los Angeles. Either Los Angeles is going to have clusters of development, high intensity, medium intensity, and low intensity, or it's going to look like Sao Paulo, Brazil. For those of you who've flown into the Sao Paulo airport, you know what I'm talking about. Talk about a meat cleaver approach. This legislation that's now working its way through Sacramento, that's a meat cleaver approach, which would basically rezone the entire LA basin, city of Los Angeles portion of the LA basin, to 5-story apartment buildings. All single-family homes would be zones would be impacted by this. If you're within a half a mile of a transit corridor is defined by the state law as any street that has a bus that runs on it at least once every 15 minutes during the peak hours. It's not just the subway, it's not just the Expo line, it's the Melrose bus, it's the Fairfax bus, it's the bus on Cesar Chavez in Boyle Heights. So think about this for a second. That is the antithesis of the centers concept. And Cal Hamilton, may he rest in peace, who educated me more than anybody in my first years as a councilman, he sold me on the concept of high density, low density, clusters rather than corridors of density. We have one really high density corridor, that's Wilshire Boulevard, and it's what I've always termed as a linear center. It's an anomaly, it is, and it is what it is, and it needs to be acknowledged as that. But otherwise, the center's concept is a decent aspirational goal. And just give me a second. And I would say that Prop U, rather than being a meat cleaver approach, remember, Prop U did not apply to anything above Height District 1. Any districts that had Height District 2, 6-1, or Height District 3, 10-1, or Height District 4, 13-1, downtown Hollywood, the Wilshire Corridor, and some nodes in the San Fernando Valley were exempted from it. All redevelopment projects were exempted from Prop U. It was really the strip commercial zones of the city that were impacted, and it was an homage to the centers concept. If you're going to have centers, you got to have non-centers, and what was beginning to happen, Beverly Center, Fujita Building in Encino, Westside Pavilion, you're starting to see centers pop up everywhere. On Prop 13, now I lost my train of thought of what I was going to say about Prop 13. Yes. We have a tendency, all of us do, to say, well, this, and I was an opponent of Prop 13. And I used all the scare tactics that everybody else used at the time because we believed them. We believed it would be a disaster, and it could have been a disaster but for the state having a $7 billion surplus that they shared with us. But remember what motivated Prop 13. It was a whole millions and millions of people in L.A. County alone, not to mention beyond in the state of California, who were watching their lives pass before, the middle-class homeowners who were watching their lives pass before their eyes. I'm writing a memoir now, and I just finished a chapter on Prop 13, and I won't go into it, but there was a seminal meeting I had in a neighborhood meeting where a woman came up to me and showed me her two tax bills, one from 1976 and one from 1977. Her tax bill in 76 was $1,500. The tax bill in 77 was for $7,500. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot today, but it was a lot then. And a five-fold increase in somebody's property tax in 1 year is a colossal problem, both a moral as well as a political problem. And when all of us buy IBM stock, if the IBM stock doubles in value, we don't pay a tax on that value increase until we sell the stock. But when your home increases in value by fivefold, you got to pay for it every time the tax assessor sends it. And that was so we adjusted to the Prop 13 reality. How did we adjust? We found other sources of revenues, fees. We started charging for garbage collection. We rated the parking. John Fisher is here and Alan Rifkin. They could speak to it better than I can. We rated the parking fund that you put your nickels and quarters in the parking meters. We raised and we went to the public because Prop 13 allowed us to go to the public and get a 2/3 vote, and now it's almost
and of course
routine.
Sales tax as well,
and sales tax and everything.
So
we did not get eviscerated by it, but it did change things, some for the better for some people and some for the worse for some people.
I want to pick up on Jan's point about some of the inequities perhaps related to Prop 13 and kind of take a moment to look at this plan kind of through an equity lens and to think about this plan as well at a time that was being developed on the heels of Watts, 1965. This is the time, though, also of Sam Yorty as mayor, Cal Hamilton, a very visionary planning director, the end of Chief Parker, his legacy at LAPD. It's a very interesting time in Los Angeles. And we have a plan that says the following, though. There is a call for equity within the plan. It speaks to availability of equal opportunities for education and employment to all persons of all social, economic, and ethnic groups, availability of adequate housing to persons of all social, economic, and ethnic groups, alleviation of poverty is mentioned, although it follows that by saying achievement of social order as the end of that segment. It's an interesting mix of ideas in Los Angeles of the late 1960s and early 70s. What's the legacy of this plan in terms of equity?
Well, the legacy is that it wasn't achieved, and that I'm not sure what they thought equity was at the time, but I'll take a wild guess, and I think it was maybe put a grocery store here or there. There was no involvement with community, no real pursuit of community input, and it was them and those folks. and there wasn't a lot of interconnectedness. I'm very struck by a story I was told by Pastor Betty Price from the Crenshaw Christian Center, who their church is located at 81st in Vermont. She was here for the first riot. She was here for the second riot. And she said they're still having the same conversations and they're still fighting for the same things. The neighborhood retail on the major corridor, housing for first-time home buyers, the food desert issues are still there, and the pursuit of equity in one's own community.
And then, Emily, you were taking on framework on the heels of 92 and the unrest in 1992. How did you view, again, the legacy of Concept Los Angeles?
Well, I can give you three really, I hope, insightful incidences. One is we developed 4 principles in the general plan framework, and they included social equity and environmental justice. So this was in 92. As part of the principles of the framework, carrying forward maybe with a little more precision and more analytical work, the Concept LA. But we found when we did our citywide neighborhood workshops, such a difficult and strong distrust in East LA for the reasons that I think Professor Estrada presented earlier, and in South Los Angeles. Enormous distrust, driven in part by redevelopment and the experience of redevelopment in the South LA communities. So in handling those workshops, we had a different approach to it. We provided childcare. We had a very diverse staff working in those workshops so that we weren't just coming from downtown LA out to the neighborhoods. But the other anecdote story was we had a workshop scheduled in South Los Angeles the day after the first of the civil unrest. And I had consultants on the consultant team who did not want to go to South LA because they were afraid. We went to South LA. We had a commitment for a workshop. We showed up. We held it. We had childcare for everyone. And none of the city staff flinched at this. But that kind of externality or external observation of the city of Los Angeles, I think, was instructive in terms of the mindset of some of the people who were working on the project.